there's never really been any recognition to the enormous contribution that young people, and especially young people on the Cape Flats, had made to our liberation.
This was the act which introduced the pass laws. Through this act, the mines and agriculture were provided with an abundance of cheap labor. Apartheid was simply white domination over the indigenous people and other black people in South Africa in order to provide a cheap labor force.
At high school, you don't really understand what it is that you want. You do understand what it is that you're against. We knew that apartheid was wrong. We could see it physically in our own school. We were at a colored school. We could see it in the geographical location where people stayed. We could see it in the demographics of visiting the beaches or restaurants. So it was in your face. People tend to romanticize that period. I don't think there was anything romantic about it.
In the period of the 80s, I was a student activist. I started my activism when I was 14 years old.
My daughters, they all were involved at school. School was courses because they felt the education wasn't like good enough, so they had to do something.
I don't think you can avoid knowing about politics if you go to Livingston High School, because it, like one of the old Unity Movement schools, was steeped in politics. We formed the Committee of 81. We started with about 20 schools, it became 40 schools, and then almost 100 schools. And then also at the same time, COSAS was formed.
Once I got involved, we had a lot of political education. Then you make a choice that is not like picking up a stone and throwing a stone, but it is really informed by a deeper level of consciousness about what is fundamentally right and wrong.
The 80s generation was definitely the thinking generation. We were tactical, we were strategic, we understood the words, we understood how to build alliances.
We leveled this was sort of a very hilly area, and we leveled this in 1987 only. Council wouldn't give it to us unless we indicated that we were coloureds. And we said, no, we don't want to be associated with that. They introduced what was the tricameral system, the so-called coloured parliament, so-called Indian parliament, and of course we already knew about the white parliament. And our students then took a particular stance against this ethnicity, starting to think on a non-racial basis.
They never enjoyed the youth. They never went to movies or stuff like that children should really do. Their involvement was really just a struggle. The highlight was meetings, making placards.
At the time, of course, there was also this demand of no education before liberation.
You had the unity movement preaching that we must be very careful of boycotting our education, that it could lead to the destruction of people. And you also had people preaching that you must have liberation now. The adults were talking about it, but the students were going into action.
And Weinberg, as this quiet middle-class area, was really a site of struggle.
The apartheid state didn't declare that a white area. And part of the reason was because it had this active management committee which supported the National Party and in fact supported apartheid.
Luxurama was the hub of activity in Wynberg. I mean, everybody knew the Lux, everybody knew the Lux.
The owners came out of detention bemoaning the fact that there were kids as young as 13 in detention, and they asked if there wasn't anything that could be done.
The Lux was used as fundraising for different organizations.
So all of that was taking place right under the noses of the apartheid state.
Those days, you were very scared. You didn't openly speak about politics because you didn't know who to speak to.
People would only share feelings with people that they all knew. I realized that I need to start photographing what I'm seeing. It was just an extension of my being a photographic student into documenting student political uprising. The police would be undercover in cars and you blended into the crowd. So what I did was I would just have an ordinary bag, and then when the police comes, the camera goes into the bag and I'm very innocently part of the crowd. And that's how you survived.
In the 70s, I had the great privilege to leave the country for a short while to pursue what I then thought was my interest in documentary filmmaking. So when I returned, the country was basically on the verge of what for me seemed like the revolution was about to start.
The state now was on the up, definitely. And so we were heavily targeted.
They locked up all our children. Yasmina, I don't know how many years she was in prison. Even myself, I couldn't even sleep here at home because the police used to come here every day. They used to sit in the cars outside watching this house, watching all the movements at this place.
Very young school children at primary school and high school were engaging the police. We're saying we need liberation, this can't continue. We're linking up with worker unions and forming an alliance of workers and students.
30 years ago, there was a migration across the peninsula, a cultural, a political, a social migration.
Students were trying to march from Bonteheuwel into Langa to show solidarity with people in Langa.
We were seeing the possibility of breaking down those barriers.
It was an amazing sort of spirit which just seemed to gain momentum. And it was a development which the apartheid government feared.
This road was was a hotbed of activity. This is what they did. They hid behind the wall, got up, threw their bombs or whatever, or their stones, get down again, and then just run away.
There was a pattern and a rhythm and a flow to which these things were. So you have the rally with the speakers and the students, and that almost become a religious frenzy. And the first stone would be flung, and then the first tear gas canister would be fired.
So you can imagine the commotion and the struggle for people to actually breathe in that.
And then the police would charge and beat up whoever they could beat up and drag off whoever they could drag off.
There was a little hole in the fence, and they used to go through the fence and hide in my sister's backyard.
This house was very much in the news because the kids used to run in here. This door was always open. And they knew that if anything should happen, they could run in here for shelter.
People used to come and get me at home and say, come, they demonstrating at the schools and they arresting children. Or Park Road is burning. Then I used to go. These policemen in the blue uniforms, that they should even just beat the children. Then you think, but where's your sympathy towards these kids? Haven't you got children and that?
And then, of course, brewed 85. Students were demanding a non-racial educational system. They were demanding proper infrastructure at their schools. They wanted a new South Africa. They didn't believe in apartheid.
The protests were becoming a little bit more bold, and the state was becoming a lot more aggressive, using rubber bullets, tear gas, arresting more of us, putting some into solitary confinement, really raiding the schools.
I remember Oliver Tambo making a call, make the country ungovernable. That night, Weinberg was aflame.
On the 5th and the 6th, there shall be a stay away. And I hope that our people will stay away in their millions so that the economy of this country can feel the power of our oppressed people when we make up our mind.
I'm glad that our country's talking and that, people are coming to the fore to tell their stories, because I think for a long time we've not told our stories. And there's a lot of hurt within community.
on the day that the Weinberg 7 were arrested, a gathering was going to be held at the Weinberg Secondary School. Weinberg Secondary was supposed to be a showcase apartheid school, the model for what could happen if people, in fact, behaved, and yet thousands of students descended on Weinberg that day.
And of course, true to form, the police came, not just broke up the rally, but tear gassed and beat up students, kids really, as they did almost on a daily basis.
Of course, the school was closed. So they were all here at home, doing absolutely nothing. But here was kids on the corner, throwing petrol bombs and burning tires and things like that. And then one of the vans passed, and they threw a petrol bomb at the van. You know, one of these big police vans. And then it reversed and it pulled up right across the road over there. And the policeman jumped out. And all the kids were scattering and they were running. They were running in the yard and all over.
I'm Mavis Stubbs, the mother of Julian Stubbs, who was arrested in October 1985.
I get a call, you know, at work to say, Julian's been arrested. I said, for what? Good Lord.
And you know, there were so many arrests taking place at that particular time, and children getting involved in different things. Every day when Julian went to school, Julian, please don't get involved in anything, stay out of trouble.
That particular day, there was a lot of activity in Weinberg, and I was driving around with a group of friends in Weinberg, and Shoki was also doing something similar. He was only 14 years old, and he ended up being a victim of circumstances.
There's still marks of what happened to the door. The front door was kicked in. Okay, they bashed into the house. The kids was all sitting in this room. They bashed in the back door, and then they started hitting the kids and whipping them.
And Julian tells me that all he did was to pick up a stone, to throw it into the fire, and he says, that's my contribution to the struggle.
That's right.
And they arrested him.
In many ways, they were innocent. I'm not even sure who of them were involved. I know Wayne was involved, because Wayne I worked with on the Congress of South African Students, because at that point the Congress of South African Students was banned.
Obviously some was guilty, they were. But I mean, you can't call them guilty because they were fighting a cause, and which was a just cause.
And they end up as the Weinberg 7. But it could have been any number of those hundreds of kids who were there on the day.
My job, because I was a bit older, was when students were arrested to go and bail them out at the police station.
Normally the practice was you'd get dragged to the police station, you'd get a few smacks, the lawyers would arrive, and you'd get released. What surprised me was that they were actually charged.
The students were trying to get into the cupboard, behind the cupboard, and all over. And as I came out, someone just grabbed me at the scruff of my neck, and then I just saw that this Ihsan was on the arm. He grabbed myself and Ihsan or something, and Venetia and Rochelle was on the other. He had with the two hands, and we were pushed into the van, and there was nothing we could do because it happened so fast.
From 86 to the end of 86, it was in court, out of court. And every time we had to take off from work, and Julian, of course, had to take off from school.
During the court case, it was the whole question of them having petrol bombs. I mean, this thing lasted for almost a year and a half.
The trial was a long trial, and as a 14-year-old, the psychological impact of that trial is tremendous. Then on top of it, the fact that you are innocent and you're found guilty and having to spend a year in prison, that is another big act, okay?
And I think what happened was that the state was trying to make examples of students.
Because Weinberg is this middle-class area, and now gaan ons vir julle wys.
In fact, magistrates who were sympathetic told us that they had been called to meetings addressed by the security police and were told that the sentences had to increase to deter particularly school children. But that wasn't the only campaign taking place at the time. South Peninsula had started the Bradley van Niekerk campaign. Bradley had been arrested more or less at the same time.
We were not scared of the big Caspers. We were not scared of the guns. You come with guns, we chase you off with stones. That's all we had.
And so you had the Bradley van Niekerk campaign and you had this Weinberg 7 campaign, and the two groups worked together to publicize what was happening. and to say to the world, we've got to put pressure on the South African government to change.
Amnesty International was very involved. It was with youngsters.
And I remember the vigil the night before and the stoic bravery of these young, primarily middle-class kids going off to prison with clenched fists and singing freedom songs.
Weinberg actually took center stage in the world. I think the BBC and all over.
And bear in mind, it's 1985. And by 1987, the apartheid government was negotiating with the ANC. So in fact, the Weinberg 7 were arrested at a time of intense political struggle and activities in our country. In fact, at a time of intense revolutionary activity in our country. And they needed to understand that. But they were very young. And many of them failed to understand properly what had been happening to them.
On the stoep over there, from there the entire school left the school grounds to go and take them to Paulsmoor. So, I don't know, it must have been about 13 buses.
I think it was like a cavalcade of cars that went to Paulsmoor that morning. It's a scene you wouldn't want to relive.
It's going to be a loss in our home, but he's got to be brave. All we can do is just pray for the best.
But Paulsmoor, from my youth and what it was in those days, was a hardcore prison for hardcore criminals.
We loved Shaki to bits, and he was a very innocent boy, and he was innocent in this whole thing, and he was so strong, and I was standing on the hill, and I was so heartsore that my baby brother, they're taking my baby brother.
Africa, continua a luta, a luta.
Okay.
Yes, it was actually a very traumatic experience that morning and that.
And I will never forget how brave those parents and family tried to be the night before, tried to be outside the gates, the poignant singing of Nkosi Sikuleli, and then I pretty much forgot about them.
The hardest thing being in prison is being away from your family. It's a breeding ground for disease. It's a breeding ground for crime. I speak a lot when we talk about crime, and if you want to stop crime in Western Cape or Cape Town, close Paulsmoor prison. Being men, young boys will give up their soul for food. Yeah.
When they came out, there was no one. There was no one really to help them, to bring them back into the community, because we don't know what went on inside there. They were treated in maximum prison.
When he came back, different friends. Friends was the drugs that he took. And he wasn't a person like that.
He used to change the subject when he came out. He never wanted to speak about what happened to him. But I knew deep down something had happened to him.
Look at him.
The illness, psychological illness, the schizophrenia, it basically came to the forefront, and his condition is such now that he's still in denial in terms of his illness. So I have physically got to take him to Valkenburg for his once-a-month injection. Thereafter, he's okay for the next 2 weeks, and then as the medication wanes, then he basically falls back into the schizophrenia, etc.
If it brings back that emotion in us, what about the one who is the victim. The saddest part is he's still pushing us away. He lashes out at all of us. But I think that is where the schizophrenia comes in. And we can't say if, because we can't turn back the clock. And all we can ask is that, please, he needs to be in a safe place. And that is my mom's greatest worry, that what is going to happen to him when she's not there. She's also, I think, trying to make up because she thinks it's her fault that he went to prison. She thinks she could have stopped him that day. And you know, it's just circumstances. It just happened. He was at the wrong place at the wrong time.
And then I think I encountered them again with the Truth Commission. And I think what struck me was what different people they were to those defiant, idealistic youngsters that went into prison.
All truth commissions, like all transitional justice processes, are compromises. They are never perfect. But I also think that if you don't deal with the past in some way, it lies buried in ways that are very damaging to the new society.
All they were asking for was that their criminal record be expunged. And I thought at the time, my God, I would have thought that that's already gone and that they would, be asking for other stuff.
I remember the TRC, okay? Because of his illness, okay, Shoki was in no condition to make a good judgment call in terms of whether to go or not to go, and he decided not to go.
The consequences are sad, I think, because I know Venetia was struggling to clear her name. But when I look mostly at Shoki, then that's the worst for me. Completely mentally disturbed, sitting on a corner every day, and, there's no sense of holding this person.
They should actually be looked upon as heroes and heroines.
What I saw at the Truth Commission is the unfortunate consequence of history and the way in which we quickly forget the tremendous sacrifices and traumas that families went through.
It's like they were lost in history. And for what? For a few to enrich themselves?
Then when you add to that the fact that if so many of the other apartheid injustices, not those gross violations, the injustices that come with forced removals, with inadequate education, with continuing lack of educational opportunities for people, there's no restitution process for people who suffered the apartheid injustice. And that makes people's lives really stuck in the past because there isn't a way of getting out of it.
We still live in these racially divided little enclaves, and one would have hoped that given the sacrifices that were made by young people, Cape Town would today be a different place, and it's not.
I'm very disappointed in what we stood for, and it's not being done.
People are confused. They say, well, what did we struggle for? Did we replace one form of oppression with another? It is because people don't see the hope.
Was it worthwhile fighting this cause? Did I really support the ANC, what the ANC is doing today? That's all questions, but put on my youth hat, I'll do it any day again.
Because you may sometimes reflect, as many people probably are, and saying, was it worth it? And I think every little contribution that was made towards bringing about change in this country has been worth it.
I'm not sure what it can teach us, but what it can remind us of is what the possibilities were and what is still possible in this country. 30 years ago, through these actions of the youth movement, we saw glimmers of what a non-racial country can be.
If we're waiting for a Messiah to come and rescue us from this oblivion of struggle, it's never going to happen. During the days of the struggle, our resources was ourselves.
There was such an awareness that what divides us was wrong and artificial, and it was within our power to unite.
We have to continue to be activists wherever we are.